Chapter 2, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, School Days in Hartford, 1824 through 1832. Part 1. Miss Catherine Beecher, Professor Fisher, The Wreck of the Albion and Death of Professor Fisher, The Minister's Wooing, Miss Catherine Beecher's Spiritual Journey, Mrs. Stowe's Recollections of her School Days in Hartford, Her Conversion, Unites with the First Church in Hartford, Her Doubts and Subsequent Religious Development, Her Final Peace. The school days in Hartford began a new era in Harriet's life. It was the formative period, and it is therefore important to say a few words concerning her sister Catherine, under whose immediate supervision she was to continue her education. In fact, no one can comprehend either Mrs. Stowe or her writings without some knowledge of the life and character of this remarkable woman, whose strong, vigorous mind and tremendous personality indelibly stamped themselves on the sensitive, yielding, dreamy, and poetic nature of the younger sister. Mrs. Stowe herself has said that the two persons who most strongly influenced her at this period of her life were her brother Edward and her sister Catherine. Catherine was the oldest child of Lyman Beecher and Roxana Foote, his wife. In a little battered journal found among Catherine's papers is a short sketch of her life, written when she was 76 years of age. In a tremulous hand she begins, quote, I was born at East Hampton, Long Island, September 5th, 1800, at 5 p.m., in the large parlor opposite father's study. Don't remember much about it myself. End quote. The sparkle of wit in this brief notice of the circumstances of her birth is very characteristic. All through her life, little ripples of fun were continually playing on the surface of that current of intense thought and feeling in which her deep, earnest nature flowed. When she was 10 years of age, her father removed to Litchfield, Connecticut, and her happy girlhood was passed in that place. Her bright and versatile mind and ready wit enabled her to pass brilliantly through her school days with but little mental exertion, and those who knew her slightly might have imagined her to be only a bright, thoughtless, light-hearted girl. In Boston, at the age of 20, she took lessons in music and drawing, and became so proficient in these branches as to secure a position as teacher in a young ladies' school, kept by a Reverend Mr. Judd, an Episcopal clergyman, at New London, Connecticut. About this time she formed the acquaintance of Professor Alexander Metcalf Fisher of Yale College, one of the most distinguished young men in New England. In January of the year 1822 they became engaged, and the following spring Professor Fisher sailed for Europe to purchase books and scientific apparatus for the use of his department in the college. In his last letter to Miss Beecher, dated March 31st, 1822, he writes, quote, I set out at 10 precisely tomorrow in the Albion for Liverpool. The ship has no superior in the whole number of excellent vessels belonging to this port, and Captain Williams is regarded as first on their list of commanders. The accommodations are admirable, fare $140. Unless our ship should speak some one bound to America on the passage, you will probably not hear from me under 2 months. End quote. Before 2 months had passed came vague rumors of a terrible shipwreck on the coast of Ireland, then the tidings that the Albion was lost. Then came a letter from Mr. Pond at Kinsdale, Ireland, dated May 2nd, 1822. Quote, You have doubtless heard of the shipwreck of the Albion packet of New York, bound to Liverpool. It was a melancholy shipwreck. It happened about 4 o'clock on the morning of the 22nd of April. Professor Fisher of Yale College was one of the passengers. Out of 23 cabin passengers, but one reached the shore. He is Mr. Everhart of Chester County, Pennsylvania. He informs me that Professor Fisher was injured by things that fetched away in the cabin at the time the ship was knocked down. This was between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening of the 21st. Mr. Fisher, though badly bruised, was calm and resolute, and assisted Captain Williams by taking the injured compass to his berth and repairing it. About 5 minutes before the vessel struck, Captain Williams informed the passengers of their danger, and all went on deck except Professor Fisher, who remained sitting in his berth. Mr. Everhart was the last person who left the cabin, and the last who ever saw Professor Fisher alive." I should not have spoken of this incident of family history with such minuteness, except for the fact that it is so much a part of Mrs. Stowe's life as to make it impossible to understand either her character or her most important works without it. Without this incident, The Minister's Wooing never would have been written, for both Mrs. Marvin's terrible soul struggles and old Candace's direct and effective solution of all religious difficulties find their origin in this stranded, storm-beaten ship on the coast of Ireland, and the terrible mental conflicts through which her sister afterward passed, for she believed Professor Fisher eternally lost. No mind more directly and powerfully influenced Harriet's than that of her sister Catherine, unless it was her brother Edward's, and that which acted with such overwhelming power on the strong, unyielding mind of the older sister must have, in time, a permanent and abiding influence on the mind of the younger. After Professor Fisher's death, his books came into Miss Beecher's possession, and among them was a complete edition of Scott's works. It was an epoch in the family history when Dr. Beecher came downstairs one day with a copy of Ivanhoe in his hand and said, "I have always said that my children should not read novels, but they must read this one." The 2 years following the death of Professor Fisher were passed with Miss Catherine Beecher at Franklin, Massachusetts, at the home of Professor Fisher's parents, where she taught his 2 sisters, studied mathematics with his brother Willard, and listened to Dr. Emmons' fearless and pitiless preaching. Hers was a mind too strong and buoyant to be crushed and prostrated by that which would have driven a weaker and less resolute nature into insanity. Of her it may well be said, quote, "She faced the spectres of the mind and laid them, thus she came at length to find a stronger faith her own." Gifted naturally with a capacity for close metaphysical analysis and a robust fearlessness in following her premises to a logical conclusion, she arrived at results startling and original, if not always of permanent value. In 1840 she published in the Biblical Repository an article on free agency, which has been acknowledged by competent critics as the ablest refutation of Edwards on the will which has appeared. An amusing incident connected with this publication may not be out of place here. A certain eminent theological professor of New England, visiting a distinguished German theologian and speaking of this production, said, quote, "The ablest refutation of Edwards on the will which was ever written is the work of a woman, the daughter of Dr. Lyman Beecher." The worthy Teuton raised both hands in undisguised astonishment. Quote, "You have a woman that can write an able refutation of Edwards on the will? God forgive Christopher Columbus for discovering America." Not finding herself able to love a God whom she thought of in her own language as a perfectly happy being, unmoved by my sorrows or tears, and looking upon me only with dislike and aversion, she determined to find happiness in living to do good. Quote, "It was right to pray and read the Bible, so I prayed and read. It was right to try to save others, so I labored for their salvation. I never had any fear of punishment or hope of reward all these years." She was tormented with doubts. Quote, "What has the Son of God done which the meanest and most selfish creature upon earth would not have done? After making such a wretched race and placing them in such disastrous circumstances, somehow, without any sorrow or trouble, Jesus Christ had a human nature that suffered and died. If something else besides ourselves will do all the suffering, who would not save millions of wretched beings and receive all the honor and gratitude without any of the trouble? Sometimes, when such thoughts passed through my mind, I felt that it was all pride, rebellion, and sin." So she struggles on, sometimes floundering deep in the mire of doubt, and then lifted for the moment above it by her naturally buoyant spirits and general tendency to look on the bright side of things. In this condition of mind, Catherine came to Hartford in the winter of 1824, and began a school with 8 scholars, and it was in the practical experience of teaching that she found a final solution of all her difficulties. She continues, quote, "After 2 or 3 years, I commenced giving instruction in mental philosophy, and at the same time began a regular course of lectures and instructions from the Bible, and was much occupied with plans for governing my school, and in devising means to lead my pupils to become obedient, amiable, and pious. By degrees, I finally arrived at the following principles in the government of my school. First, it is indispensable that my scholars should feel that I am sincerely and deeply interested in their best happiness, and the more I can convince them of this, the more ready will be their obedience. Second, the preservation of authority and order depends upon the certainty that unpleasant consequences to themselves will inevitably be the results of doing wrong. Third, it is equally necessary to preserve my own influence and their affection that they should feel that punishment is the natural result of wrongdoing, in such a way that they shall regard themselves, instead of me, as the cause of their punishment. Fourth, it is indispensable that my scholars should see that my requisitions are reasonable. In the majority of cases this can be shown, and in this way such confidence will be the result that they will trust my judgment and knowledge in cases where no explanation can be given. Fifth, the more I can make my scholars feel that I am actuated by a spirit of self-denying benevolence, the more confidence they will feel in me, and the more they will be inclined to submit to self-denying duties for the good of others. After a while, I began to compare my experience with the government of God. I finally got through the whole subject, and drew out the results, and found that all my difficulties were solved, and all my darkness dispelled." Her solution, in brief, is nothing more than the view of the divine nature, which was for so many years preached by her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, and set forth in the writings of her sister, Harriet. The conception of a being of infinite love, patience, and kindness, who suffers with man. The sufferings of Christ on the cross were not the sufferings of his human nature merely, but the sufferings of the divine nature in him. In Christ we see the only revelation of God, and that is the revelation of one that suffers. This is the fundamental idea in the minister's wooing, and it is the idea of God in which the storm-tossed soul of the older sister at last found rest. All this was directly opposed to that fundamental principle of theologians, that God, being the infinitely perfect being, cannot suffer, because suffering indicates imperfection. To Miss Beecher's mind, the lack of ability to suffer with his suffering creatures was a more serious imperfection. Let the reader turn to the 24th chapter of The Minister's Wooing for a complete presentation of this subject, especially the passage that begins, quote, "Sorrow is divine, sorrow is reigning on the throne of the universe." End quote. In the fall of the year 1824, while her sister Catherine was passing through the soul crisis which we have been describing, Harriet came to the school that she had recently established. In a letter to her son, written in 1886, speaking of this period of her life, Mrs. Stowe says, quote, "Somewhere between my 12th and 13th year, I was placed under the care of my elder sister Catherine in the school that she just started in Hartford, Connecticut. When I entered the school, there were not more than 25 scholars in it, but it afterwards numbered its pupils by the hundreds. The schoolroom was on Main Street, nearly opposite Christ Church, over Sheldon and Colton's harness store, at the sign of the Two White Horses. I never shall forget the pleasure and surprise which these two white horses produced in my mind when I first saw them. One of the young men who worked in the rear of the harness store had the most beautiful tenor voice, and it was my delight to hear him singing in school hours. Quote, "When in cold oblivion's shade beauty, wealth, and power are laid, when around the sculptured shrine moss shall cling and ivy twine, where immortal spirits reign, there shall we all meet again." As my father's salary was inadequate to the wants of his large family, the expense of my board in Hartford was provided by a species of exchange. Mr. Isaac D. Bull sent a daughter to Miss Pierce's seminary in Litchfield, and she boarded in my father's family in exchange for my board in her father's family. If my good, refined, neat, particular stepmother could have chosen, she could not have found a family more exactly suited to her desires. The very soul of neatness and order pervaded the whole establishment. Mr. I. D. Bull was a fine, vigorous, white-haired man, on the declining slope of life, but full of energy and of kindness. Mr. Samuel Collins, a neighbor who lived next door, used to frequently come in and make most impressive and solemn calls on Miss Mary Ann Bull, who was a brunette and a celebrated beauty of the day. I will remember her long raven curls falling from the comb that held them up on top of her head. She had a rich soprano voice and was the leading singer in the Center Church choir. The two brothers also had fine, manly voices, and the family circle was often enlivened by quartet singing and flute playing. Mr. Bull kept a very large wholesale drugstore on Front Street, in which his two sons, Albert and James, were clerks. The oldest son, Watson Bull, had established a retail drugstore at the sign of the Good Samaritan. A large picture of the Good Samaritan, relieving the wounded traveler, formed a striking part of the sign and was contemplated by me with reverence. The mother of the family gave me at once a child's place in her heart. A neat little hall chamber was allotted to me for my own, and a well-made and kept single bed was given me, of which I took daily care with awful satisfaction. If I was sick, nothing could exceed the watchful care and tender nursing of Mrs. Bull. In school, my two most intimate friends were the leading scholars. They had written to me before I came, and I had answered their letters, and on my arrival they gave me the warmest welcome. One was Catherine Ledyard Cogswell, daughter of the leading and best-loved of Hartford physicians. The other was Georgiana May, daughter of the most lovely Christian woman, who was a widow. Georgiana was one of many children, having two younger sisters, Mary and Gertrude, and several brothers. Catherine Cogswell was one of the most amiable, sprightly, sunny-tempered individuals I have ever known. She was, in fact, so much beloved that it was difficult for me to see much of her. Her time was all bespoken by different girls. One might walk with her to school, another had the like promise on the way home. And at recess, of which we had every day a short half-hour, there was always a suppliant at Katie's shrine whom she found it hard to refuse. Yet among all these claimants she did keep a little place here and there for me. Georgiana was older and graver and less fascinating to the other girls, but between her and me there grew up the warmest friendship, which proved lifelong in its constancy. Catherine and Georgiana were reading Virgil when I came to school. I began the study of Latin alone, and at the end of the first year made a translation of Ovid in verse, which was read at the final exhibition of the school, and regarded, I believe, as a very creditable performance. I was very much interested in poetry, and it was my dream to be a poet. I began a drama called Cleon. The scene was laid in the court and time of the Emperor Nero, and Cleon was a Greek lord residing at Nero's court, who, after much searching and doubting, at last comes to the knowledge of Christianity. I filled blank book after blank book with this drama. It filled my thoughts, sleeping and waking. One day Sister Catherine pounced down upon me. and said that I must not waste my time writing poetry, but discipline my mind by the study of Butler's Analogy. So, after this, I wrote out abstracts from the Analogy, and instructed a class of girls as old as myself, being compelled to master each chapter just ahead of the class I was teaching. About this time I read Baxter's Saints' Rest. I do not think any book affected me more powerfully. As I walked the pavements, I used to wish that they might sink beneath me, if only I might find myself in heaven. I was at the same time very much interested in Butler's Analogy, for Mr. Brace used to lecture on such themes when I was at Miss Pierce's school at Litchfield. I also began the study of French and Italian with a Miss Deegan, who was born in Italy. It was about this time that I first believed myself to be a Christian. I was spending my summer vacation at home in Litchfield. I shall ever remember that dewy, fresh summer morning. I knew that it was a sacramental Sunday, and thought with sadness that when all the good people should take the sacrificial bread and wine, I should be left out. I tried hard to feel my sins and count them up, but what with the birds, the daisies, and the brooks that rippled by the way, it was impossible. I came into church quite dissatisfied with myself, and as I looked upon the pure white cloth, the snowy bread and shining cups of the communion table, thought with a sigh, "There won't be anything for me today. It is all for these grown-up Christians." Nevertheless, when Father began to speak, I was drawn to listen by a certain pathetic earnestness in his voice. Most of Father's sermons were as unintelligible to me as if he had spoken in Choctaw. But sometimes he preached what he was accustomed to call a frame sermon, that is, a sermon that sprung out of the deep feeling of the occasion, and which consequently could be neither premeditated nor repeated. His text was taken from the Gospel of John, the declaration of Jesus, "Behold, I call you no longer servants, but friends." His theme was Jesus as a soul friend, offered to every human being. Forgetting all his hair-splitting distinctions and dialectic subtleties, he spoke in direct, simple, and tender language of the great love of Christ and his care for the soul. He pictured him as patient with our errors, compassionate with our weaknesses, and sympathetic for our sorrows. He went on to say how he was ever near us, enlightening our ignorance, guiding our wanderings, comforting our sorrows with a love unwearied by faults, unchilled by ingratitude, until at last he should present us faultless before the throne of his glory with exceeding joy. I sat intent and absorbed. Oh, how much I needed just such a friend, I thought to myself. Then the awful fact came over me that I had never had any conviction of my sins, and consequently could not come to him. I longed to cry out, "I will." When Father made his passionate appeal, "Come then, and trust your soul to this faithful friend," like a flash it came over me that if I needed conviction of sin, he was able to give me even this also. I would trust him for the whole. My whole soul was illumined with joy, and as I left the church to walk home, it seemed to me as if nature herself were hushing her breath to hear the music of heaven. As soon as Father came home and was seated in his study, I went up to him and fell in his arms, saying, "Father, I have given myself to Jesus, and he has taken me." I shall never forget the expression of his face as he looked down into my earnest, childish eyes. It was so sweet, so gentle, and like sunlight breaking out upon a landscape. "Is it so?" he said, holding me silently to his heart, and I felt the hot tears fall on my head. "Then has a new flower blossomed in the kingdom this day." End quote. If she could have been let alone and taught to look up and not down, forward and not back, out and not in, this religious experience might have gone on as sweetly and naturally as the opening of a flower in the gentle rays of the sun. But unfortunately this was not possible at that time, when self-examination was carried to an extreme that was calculated to drive a nervous and sensitive mind well nigh distracted. First, even her sister Catherine was afraid that there might be something wrong in the case of a lamb that had come into the fold without being first chased all over the lot by the shepherd, great stress being laid in those days on what was called being under conviction. Then also the pastor of the First Church of Hartford, a bosom friend of Dr. Beecher, looked with melancholy and suspicious eyes on this unusual and doubtful path to heaven, but more of this hereafter. Harriet's conversion took place in the summer of 1825, when she was 14, and the following year, April 1826, Dr. Beecher resigned his pastorate in Litchfield to accept a call to the Hanover Street Church, Boston, Massachusetts. In a letter to her grandmother Foote at Guilford, dated Hartford, March 4, 1826, Harriet writes, quote, "You have probably heard that our home in Litchfield is broken up. Papa has received a call to Boston, and concluded to accept, because he could not support his family in Litchfield. He was dismissed last week Tuesday, and will be here, Hartford, next Tuesday with Mamma and Isabel. Aunt Esther will take Charles and Thomas to her house for the present. Papa's salary is to be $2,000 and $500 settlement. I attend school constantly and am making some progress in my studies. I devote most of my attention to Latin and to arithmetic, and hope soon to prepare myself to assist Catherine in the school." End quote. This breaking up of the Litchfield home led Harriet, under her father's advice, to seek to connect herself with the First Church of Hartford. Accordingly, accompanied by two of her school friends, she went one day to the pastor's study to consult with him concerning the contemplated step. The good man listened attentively to the child's simple and modest statements of Christian experience, and then, with an awful though kindly solemnity of speech and manner, said, quote, "Harriet, do you feel that if the universe should be destroyed," awful pause, "you could be happy with God alone?" End quote. After struggling in vain, in her mental bewilderment, to fix in her mind some definite conception of the meaning of the sounds which fell on her ears like the measured strokes of a bell, the child of 14 stammered out, "Yes, sir." "You realize, I trust," continued the doctor, "in some measure at least, the deceitfulness of your heart, and that in punishment for your sins God might justly leave you to make yourself as miserable as you have made yourself sinful." Yes, sir," again stammered Harriet. Having thus effectually and to his own satisfaction fixed the child's attention on the morbid and oversensitive workings of her own heart, the good and truly kind-hearted man dismissed her with a fatherly benediction. But where was the joyous ecstasy of that beautiful Sabbath morning of a year ago? Where was that heavenly friend? Yet was not this as it should be, and might not God leave her to make herself as miserable as she had made herself sinful? In a letter addressed to her brother Edward about this time, she writes, quote, "My whole life is one continued struggle. I do nothing right. I yield to temptation almost as soon as it assails me. My deepest feelings are very evanescent. I am beset behind and before, and my sins take away all my happiness. But that which most constantly besets me is pride. I can trace almost all my sins back to it." End quote. In the meantime, the school is prospering. February 16, 1827, Catherine writes to Dr. Beecher, quote, "My affairs go on well. The stock is all taken up, and next week I hope to have out the prospectus of the Hartford Female Seminary. I hope the building will be done, and all things in order by June. The English lady is coming with 12 pupils from New York." End quote. Speaking of Harriet, who was at this time with her father in Boston, she adds, quote, "I have received some letters from Harriet today which make me feel uneasy. She says, quote, 'I don't know as I am fit for anything, and I have thought that I could wish to die young, and let the remembrance of me and my faults perish in the grave, rather than live, as I fear I do, a trouble to everyone. You don't know how perfectly wretched I often feel, so useless, so weak, so destitute of all energy. Mamma often tells me that I am a strange, inconsistent being. Sometimes I could not sleep, and have groaned and cried till midnight, while in the daytime I tried to appear cheerful, and succeeded so well that Papa reproved me for laughing so much. I was so absent sometimes that I made strange mistakes, and then they all laughed at me, and I laughed too, though I felt as though I should go distracted. I wrote rules, made out a regular system for dividing my time, but my feelings vary so much that it is almost impossible for me to be regular." End quote. But let Harriet take courage in her dark sorrows and melancholies. As Carlyle says, quote, "Samuel Johnson, too, had hypochondrias. All great souls are apt to have, and to be in thick darkness generally, till the eternal ways and the celestial guiding stars disclose themselves, and the vague abyss of life knits itself up into firmaments for them." End quote. At the same time, the winter of 1827, Catherine writes to Edward concerning Harriet, quote, "If she could come here (Hartford), it might be the best thing for her, for she can talk freely to me. I can get her books, and Catherine Cogswell, Georgiana May, and her friends here could do more for her than anyone in Boston, for they love her and she loves them very much. Georgiana's difficulties are different from Harriet's. She is speculating about doctrines, etc. Harriet will have young society here all the time, which she cannot have at home, and I think cheerful and amusing friends will do much for her. I can do better in preparing her to teach drawing than anyone else, for I best know what is needed." End quote. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.